I really, it's been we had an electrician decide he's going to rewire all our apartments today without telling us. So I've been running around trying to get this done. So I apologize. And it's like Murphy's Law in one day. But anyway, thank God. They say if it started on time, it wouldn't be Jewish. So I am here now. I just have to calm down a little, breathe deeply. And we're going to do is a whole series of classes, God willing, on like early Jewish history, basically focusing on the great empires that have persecuted the Jewish people and see what lessons we could learn. Besides just covering the major events, which are falling out a good time of year because we're going to have Purim soon, and that's going to be, God willing, technology permitting. Our next class, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. This is the problem I was having. I'm going to, hopefully I'll be allowed to share the screen. There we go. Let me see if I could find, here we go. I want to do actually, no, I prefer to do, hold on one second. I'm going to try doing it this way. Excuse me. I want to do try the advanced feature for one sec. Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can do it this way. Okay, and this is where this works much better if I can find the PowerPoints. Second, guys, I'll be right with you. Here we go. I hope this is it. Now, are you guys seeing this? No.
No, not yet, Ken.
Hold on. Okay, this is what happened last time. So I'm going to go back to the normal way of doing it. And we've had enough messing around today for, okay. Everything that. Never mind. Are you guys still with me here?
Yep.
Okay, now I've completely managed to. Okay, I don't see you or anything. Okay, I'm sorry. This is just. Nope. Hello?
We see you. Do you hear us?
I don't see. No, I'm not doing it. No, this is not. No, I don't see or anything. Hey, this is like Murphy's Law at its absolute best. I've lost the call completely. I do not see anything related to. Hold on. Zoom post attendee. Okay. Here we go. Okay, sorry guys. I'm going to stop playing around and just do the basic version because this is not working. I just got to find my presentation now. It's not allowing. Let me share it. For some reason, I cannot find my PowerPoint here, but one second. Let me see if I can do this. Seeing it now? Are you seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, okay, this is just wonderful. I apologize again, everyone. I gotta laugh. It's a fancy way of doing this where I put myself down in front of the screen, but I'm not gonna do anything fancy because I have enough problems today. Okay, so we're gonna with a slight delay, deal with Babylon, destruction of the first temple. And the basis for the 4 classes is a prophecy from Daniel. I don't know if you guys have ever read the book of Daniel. It's one of the hardest books to read. The first part is pretty straightforward. The latter part is all Aramaic and very esoteric. But Daniel has a vision of these different beasts that come out, and it's really interesting if you want to read the Aramaic. It says Daniel related the following. Hold on one second. Now I have my camera cutting out on me. All right. I saw 4 winds of the heavens stirring up the great sea. 4 mighty beasts, different from each other, emerged from the sea. And here's a picture of sort of what they look like, according to some artist. And each of these is interpreted as.
Ken, the PowerPoint hasn't opened up yet. We just still see your screen of where it should open. Just the files.
I don't know. Hold on 1 second. I don't know why it's not sharing. You're not seeing the PowerPoint? It's just like,
Okay,
you're not
Ken,
seeing
now
the
we see it.
PowerPoint?
Now we see it.
Okay. Thank God. I'm gonna have like a triple whiskey when I'm done with this class. Okay, here's the beasts. Sorry, again, we'll be on. Okay, 4 mighty beasts different from each other emerge from the sea. So here you can see an artist depiction of what our beasts look like. And they represent the 4 empires that are great persecutors of the Jewish people in the ancient world, which are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And we're gonna focus today on Babylon, which is the first of the great empires, and that'll lead us into, God willing, technology permitting, our next class, which is going to focus on Persia and the Purim stories. So the timing will be really good. But before we jump into the Babylonian persecution of the Jewish people, we have to, you can't start a book by just reading in the middle or reading towards the end. We have to wind backwards and understand a little bit about the period of time before. So we're going to run through a brief history of leading up to that period of time. And I have a little outline for you to look at, timeline. I know people don't love timelines, but they're great visually. The period of time we're talking about with Babylon is going to be, you can see over here, the destruction of the temple, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, 422 BCE. By the way, if you're watching and getting confused about the dates, secular historians often put the date 586 in for the date of destruction. There's a 164-year difference between the traditional Jewish calendar chronology, which is based on our tradition, and the one used by secular historians. I certainly don't want to go into a whole discussion on that now, but for the sake of being clear, I'm sticking to the traditional Jewish dates. But if you come across a 586 date for destruction of the first temple, you'll know that's where that missing 164 years actually fits in. But we have to back all the way up to basically what leads us up to the end of the Jewish Commonwealth, the first period of our existence in the land of Israel. And if we go back to the beginning, we know that we left Egypt, we go to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, we get the Torah. Here you can see it. We just read about this last week's Torah portion. And we're immediately supposed to enter the land of Israel. That's what should have happened. The Bible should have been very short. It should have been the 5 books of Moses, and then Moses would have led us into the land of Israel. We would have had a book called Moses' Conquest of the Land, and it would have been a much shorter book, and we would all be living in Israel today and cut thousands of years of Jewish history and diaspora out. But because of the spies, the sin of the spies, you can see over here, we wander in the desert for 40 years. Some people think it's because none of the men would ask for directions, but it's because we actually badmouth the land of Israel. We know what happens next. The next part of the Bible that we're going to read from now on in our weekly Torah readings coming up is we spent a year at Mount Sinai, but then 40 years wandering in the desert. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, as you guys know, Moses dies and is buried across the Jordan River. And we begin what is the book of Joshua. And I just want to add in a little note here now. I've been making my personal crusade, not a great word to use when speaking to Jewish audiences, but I am shocked at how few people have actually read anything past the book of Deuteronomy. I've been asking hundreds of yeshiva guys. And the best, all of Jewish history in the land of Israel is from the book of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, which we're going to be looking at all of that now. We're going to be doing a greatly condensed form, running through the basic plot of that story. But I highly, highly, highly recommend getting an art scroll, reading it through in English, Hebrew, and a couple times through to get the plot line, and then go back with commentaries like the Abarbanel. It's such an amazing story. Maybe convince one of the rabbis in Jacksonville to give a Nach class on the later books of the Bible. But you can see the image of the Jewish people crossing the Jordan, which, by the way, splits like the sea split when we left Egypt. And we conquer and settle the land. We have 7 years of conquest and 7 years of settling the land when we fight coalitions of Canaanite armies. This is the whole book of Joshua, which is extremely important to us because the book of Joshua gives us the biblical boundaries of the land of Israel. So we would need that book no matter what, even if the Bible was much shorter. And the biblical boundaries of Israel, by the way, are very different from the boundaries of today. There's much more of the north, what is Lebanon and Syria, and a lot of what is Jordan is part of the biblical Israel. In the south, not so much. That's some of what's today. The Negev area would not be part of Israel back then. But I wanted to focus, especially when we're doing this class, because rather than just running through events and chronology and names and places, to pull out some really big lessons. Because one of the things we have to appreciate to get anything in the Bible, ladies and gentlemen, and it's been a closed book for 2,500 years, is it has to meet two criteria. One is it has to be written by a prophet, whether it's the greatest of all prophets, Moses, or the smallest of all prophets, Obadiah, who is a convert who gets one chapter. Has to be written by a prophet and have a message that is relevant to us. So I'm specifically going to pause at a bunch of different places and focus on what I think are the messages we're taking out of these stories from the past that we can be applying to the situation, our personal situation, and the situation of the Jewish people in Israel today. So when Joshua takes over from Moses, and he's a tough act to follow, God says in the book of Joshua, he says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant, my servant Moses is dead. Prepare to cross the Jordan together with all this people into the land that I am going to give to the Israelites. Every spot on which your foot treads, I give to you, as I promised Moses. But you must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teachings that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate from it to the right nor to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. And this is such a huge point that I focus on when teaching Jewish history. When we talk about how God interacts with us on a personal level, that I can't say. Every one of us has a unique relationship with God, a different story, but collectively, it's the biggest no-brainer. Oft repeated idea in the Torah is we are in a contractual agreement that we entered with God at Mount Sinai. We keep our side of the bargain, which means keeping the Torah, both sides of it, the commandments between us and God and the commandments between us and our fellow human beings and our fellow Jews. God says you do that, and I promise you, you will have no problems. It's like a no-brainer. It's guaranteed, and God can do whatever he likes, and God doesn't change his mind. So it's pretty, very, very straightforward contractual agreement, which is repeated more than probably any other concept in the Bible. And we say it, it's so important to understanding our relationship with God that the second paragraph of the Shema is exactly this. If you listen, we'll get the rain, the crops. So we conquer the land, we settle the land, and when Joshua dies, we then enter a period of time where the Jewish people live, and you can see the map over here, is a loose confederation of tribal states, very similar to what America was before it had a massive federal government with 2 million employees today and a huge budget. It was very similar to the 13 colonies of America. At the beginning, when there was a loose confederation of tribal states with very little central leadership, a court system was set up, and you can see the land is divided by tribes according to a lottery. This is the biblical boundaries of the land of Israel, Jerusalem sitting on neutral territory between Benjamin and Judah. We had the tabernacle, which was kept in 4 different locations, the Mishkan, before it was brought to Jerusalem. It's going to be for 440 years, which is the entire period of time of Judges and the reign of King Saul and King David. It's going to be in 4 places, in Gilgal, in Shiloh, for 369 years. That's incredible. There you see Shiloh over there. You can visit biblical Shiloh today, a really cool place. Gilgal, Shiloh, Nov, and Givon. But there's no strong central leadership. And unfortunately, and this is one of the great lessons, we're given a very straightforward agreement with God. Do what we're supposed to do on our side, and he'll do what he's supposed to do, but we stray from that. And if you look at what happens, at the beginning of the book of Joshua, it says, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, and at the age of 110 years. And all that generation were likewise gathered to their forefathers. Another generation arose from them which did not experience the deliverance of the Lord and the deeds that he had wrought for Israel. They didn't see all the going out of Egypt and the cool miracles. And Israel did that which was offensive to the Lord. They worshipped the Baalim and forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, and who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples around them and bowed down to them and provoked the Lord. They forsook the Lord and worshipped the Baal and the Ashtaroth. So, by the way, when you're reading this stuff, it's not a Nach class in detail, but we have to appreciate when we read the Bible as a guidebook, which is what it is. It's not a book of Jewish law, right? It mentions Jewish law. We never learned Jewish law from the Bible. It's not a book of Jewish culture. If it was, there'd be the recipe for gefilte fish and cholent in there. It talks about cultural references for sure. It's not a book of Jewish history, although it mentions many historical events because there's huge gaps in the narrative. It's a book of Jewish worldview. But when we're reading it and trying to learn the lessons, guys, it's so important that we understand the way God speaks to us, which is over the top, often very critical. If you don't understand that, Jews come out being like the worst people on the planet. Like what, all the Jews abandoned Torah after Joshua and were all idol worshiping? Israel Zangwill, a British Zionist writer, from about 100 years ago. He said either the author of the Bible is God or an anti-Semite, because it's the only book from the ancient world where it doesn't totally glorify everyone in it. All of our faults are brought out with a spotlight on them, no skeletons in the closet, and often very exaggerated what we did wrong. And we were clearly doing things wrong back then. But it wasn't that the Jews had given up Torah, but idolatry was creeping in. And at that period of time, God held us to a very high standard. And because we stopped keeping our side of the bargain, idolatry is a big no-no in Judaism, although it's not a big attraction for us today. In the ancient world, it had a huge power. And by the way, it's not because we're more sophisticated. It's because we're much less spiritually connected than they were. But it says the Lord was incensed at Israel, and he handed them over to their foes who plundered them. He surrendered them to their enemies on all sides, that they would no longer hold their own against their enemies. Now, again, guys, we have to hit the pause button and focus here. It is so important to understand another monumentally huge lesson of how God operates in the world and in our relationship, especially with us. We keep our side of the bargain. He keeps his. We don't. He punishes us. And how do we get punished? He sends enemies against us, which means whenever we reading stories in the Bible and bad things happen to us, any of these four empires that have come against us in the story we're going to cover in the next 4 classes, or any current events going on in the world today, we have to appreciate that the symptom, the geopolitical realities are only the symptom. The cause is always something deeper, which is very empowering for us, because it means that if we have our act together, we don't have to worry. We have to defend ourselves, don't get me wrong, but we don't have to worry about the external threats. If we have our act together, they won't be there. It's such a huge, huge, huge point. So it says, we blow our side of the bargain, God delivers us to the enemies. And this brings us into this period of time of the judges. And it's incredible. The Jewish people go up and down in their relationship with God. And it said the Lord, so we would worship idols, enemies would oppress us. This is the entire book of Judges in 2 minutes. Enemies would come and oppress us. And the people would cry out. Remember that expression, no atheists in the foxholes. And then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from those who plundered them. But they did not heed the judges either. They went astray after other gods and bowed down to them. They were quick to turn aside from the way their fathers had followed in obedience to the commandments of the Lord. They did not do right. When the Lord raised up the judges for them, the Lord would be with the judges and he would save them from their enemies. I changed it, it's supposed to be the judges. The head chieftain translated. I like the word shofet better. During the judge's lifetime, for the Lord would be moved to pity the moaning because of those who oppressed and crushed them. And again, the great lesson here is, in the entire book of Judges in a minute, is we would decline in our spiritual relationship, either with each other or usually in this case with God, by worshiping idols. God would send oppressors against us, no atheists in the foxholes. We'd cry out to God, a judge would come according to the level of the tshuva we did, would be the level of the salvation we got. Some of these judges were incredible people. Some of them were really interesting characters. Like Samson is one of the most interesting ones. Yiftach is hardly seemingly the most amazing one, whereas, Ehud, or the best man for the job is a woman, Deborah, Dvorah, she gets the job. But it's this roller coaster ride of, as soon as things get good, we get fat, we get lazy, we get comfortable, we forget, and we slide spiritually. And that's that period of time going for almost 400 years of the book of Judges. And I have different images. There's Deborah, there's Gideon with his trumpets, there's Samson bringing the house down. But it's also interesting what it says, and it's another big lesson for us throughout all of Jewish history, and certainly this period of time. It says in the book of Judges, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as he pleased. Simple reading of the story is there was anarchy, like Antifa was running around. No, not at all. On one hand, we see that there's a lot of negativity going on, but there are huge periods of peace and tranquility. We tend to focus on the bad times, but the Talmud calls that the book of Judges Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight. And this is another huge lesson we have to keep in mind as we're going through this history. Yashar, when you ask for directions in Israel, they go Yashar, Yashar, go straight, go straight, go straight. But Yashar means straight, like straight guy. Because despite all of our failings and our falling down, what was ideal at that period of time, which you have to keep in mind, is that Judaism is not about strong central leadership. It's about taking personal responsibility, being an educated Jew, having fear of God, and taking responsibility for yourself. That is your greatness as a human being. So in many ways, despite all the tumult that's going on in the book of Judges, it's considered to be, in many ways, an ideal period of time. But it's very difficult to live in such a situation without central leadership. You got to take a lot of responsibility for yourself. And it's human nature not to take so much responsibility. So what happens is that after 368 years of judges, the Jewish people go to Samuel, the last of the judges, one of the greatest of all the judges, and they say, give us a king. And this is the beginning of the monarchy. And Samuel will anoint King Saul as king of Israel. And Saul is a very tragic figure. Again, we're flying through Saul's story, but he has misplaced modesty. One of the great lessons we learn from Jewish history, which is so applicable throughout all time we see today, is how hard it is to lead the Jewish people. You have to have an incredibly strong personality, but you have to be really diplomatic. If you're in any way weak or misplaced modesty, the Jewish people will walk all over you and push you around. But if you are really aggressive and you push too hard on them, they'll just push back on you. So it requires a unique combination of strength and diplomacy, which Saul, sadly, for all of his greatness, being head and shoulders above everyone else, as described in the Bible, still is not great enough. And his reign tragically only lasts for a few years. And he is replaced by David, the famous David who killed the enemy of the Jewish people, Goliath, that you see. David, by the way, is the model for leadership in the Jewish world. He's like Plato's philosopher king. He's the full package. He is a king, he is spiritual, he is a poet, he is a musician, he is a warrior, he is a prophet. He's got everything. He has flaws, he makes some big mistakes, but he also owns his mistakes. And this is bringing us into the monarchy. That will be the monarchy that will be with us through the entire period of time through to the end of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, which is the monarchy of King David. Leadership in the Jewish world on a Torah level, being a judge, comes according to your merit. It's open to everyone. Priesthood goes to the children of Aaron. Kingship only comes from one tribe, Judah, and from one family, the family of King David. And Beit David, the house of David, is a euphemistic term for the royal bloodline of the Jewish people, from whom all legitimate kings will come, including all the guys we're going to see in just a few minutes, even some really bad ones. That's the problem with inheriting power as opposed to earning it. You don't necessarily guarantee you're going to get high quality people. And then in the case of royalty today, you get a lot of inbred people. I always jokingly say you marry your first cousin for 400 years, end up with Prince Charles. I hope there's no British people listening. I'm in trouble. But King David has the right stuff. And it's King David who will officially establish the royal bloodline of the Jewish people. King David will finally conquer Jerusalem 440 years after Joshua. It's amazing. The city of Jerusalem, like several other Canaanite enclaves, will remain enclaves, even though God said to get rid of these people. Again, we often try and second guess God, a big mistake we make in the First Temple period. We're always second guessing God, trying to be more merciful than him, not following his instructions. You can't be more merciful than God, by the way. But we leave pockets of Canaanites in the land of Israel, which is what causes all the problems we have during the book of Judges and later, because their influence, their idolatry will be constantly seeping into the Jewish people. And in the entire book of the Bible, Kings, which is what we're going to getting into just a minute, the Jewish people are a lot of them are worshiping idols, but they're also keeping kosher and keeping Shabbat, something it's hard for us to imagine. We wanted to get the high, the authentic high of our relationship with God, and the high from idolatry, which you could get a huge high out of. But anyway, King David will conquer the city of Jerusalem from the Jebusites, which again will have remained a Jewish city in the heart of a Jewish country for hundreds and hundreds of years. Such a weird concept, like leaving the British in the United States in like Georgetown outside Washington, D.C. until like 2276. For 400 years, they're hanging out there with, having tea at 4 o'clock with the queen on their money. King David conquers Jerusalem. He will bring the ark to Jerusalem. He will build a palace. Here's a picture of King David's palace, you can see. They think they actually found that, archaeologically speaking. And he will establish a dynasty centered in Jerusalem. But he will bequeath, and King David fights many wars, and he will bequeath an expanded Jewish kingdom, the largest physical Jewish empire in history, even bigger than Hollywood, which is the other Jewish empire. He will he will leave a large Jewish kingdom with vassal states going all the way in the north out to the Assyrian Empire and all the way in the south down to Egypt to his son Solomon. And this is the zenith of Jewish history. People always ask me, what's it going to be like in the Messianic era? And I always talk about how the closest thing we've ever gotten to is the reign of King Solomon. We have 40 years of peace and prosperity. Solomon becomes king at 12 years old. His father dies at age 70, but his father bequeaths him an incredible kingdom. And it's perfect timing that the great world powers that surround us are in a state of contraction. And Israel is able to have peace and prosperity. Solomon will build the first temple, which will stand for 410 years in Jerusalem. These are amazing periods of time. You know, we talk about American history is whatever, 200 and something years old, 30 something years. These are huge periods of time we're talking about here. But it is a golden age. Solomon's the wisest of all men. Everyone is coming to learn from him, which, by the way, is a great insight for us as to how we're supposed to really change the world. It's not about conquering. It's not about converting. It's about creating on an individual and collective level role models for the world. This is such an important part of understanding what we're supposed to be doing in our mission in the land of Israel and how we fell so short in this first temple period. Proactivity in Judaism is being proud Jews and having a balanced relationship with each other and with God and creating communities, family, and a country that is a model. And if you get it right, the world will want to learn from you, which is why they said they came from all over the world to learn from King Solomon. So we have a great father-son team of David and Solomon. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way in history, that sons can follow in their father's footsteps. And that's sadly what's going to happen. But we have what is a first temple period of 410 years. And there's a picture of King Solomon's beautiful, beautiful temple, which took him 6 years to build, the national building project of the Jewish people. But the lead up to the destruction of Babylon begins really, and Jewish history and events in Jewish history often take a long time to unfold. In this case, it's going to take several hundred years to unfold, because when Solomon will die, he will bequeath his kingdom to his son Rehoboam. And you can see, by the way, here, this is the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the united monarchy, which is under David and Solomon, under King David for 33 years, under Solomon for 40 years. But unfortunately, Rehoboam is not a very smart man when it comes to ruling. The Jewish people in the north come to him and ask him maybe to ease up on them. And he comes back and tells them, I'm going to be even more strict than my father was. Big mistake. You cannot push Jews too hard. And they break away like America in the Civil War in 1861. And like the Confederacy and Union. Now, you guys are south of the Mason-Dixon, I know, and you can see here a picture of the divided monarchy. You'll have two kingdoms that will be founded now. You will have a kingdom in the north, basically made up of 10 tribes. And you can see that much of what is biblical Israel is across the Jordan River over here. Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. And that will be called Israel. And they'll be, as we'll see in a minute, they'll have their own kings. They'll be a separate country. And there'll be basically the tribe of Judah in the south with part of Benjamin and with Shimon. And they'll be called Judah, after the tribe of Judah, which is the majority of the tribe, with Jerusalem as their capital. The northern kingdom will first have Tirzah as a capital and later have Samaria as a capital. By the way, Rehoboam wants to go to war to forcibly reunite the union like Abraham Lincoln does in 1861. But Achia Hashiloni, the prophet, says, It's not God's will that you have this whole kingdom. It's not up to you. Because of mistakes your father made, Solomon, and because of the big mistakes you made, it's going to be a divided kingdom. And that's exactly what we're going to have, a divided monarchy. And as Abraham Lincoln said so beautifully, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And here you can look and see, by the way, the lists of, it happens to work out that there are 20 kings of Israel in the north, with Tirzah or Samaria, Shamron, their capital, which is where the terms Judea and Samaria come from today that we use, and 20 kings of the south. The kings of the south, the kings of Judah with Jerusalem as the capital, are all direct descendants of King David. The kings of the north are usually, there's a few of them who are children of their parents, but most of them have no connection to King David. And unfortunately, we see that there's only, I like this list that I found online, that every one of these kings, and some of them, the Bible, this is the book of Kings we're dealing with now, which is going to end with the destruction of the northern and southern kingdoms. But the Bible sometimes touches on these people for just a few sentences. But generally what it says was the so-and-so was son of so-and-so, reigned in whatever, in the Shamron or in Jerusalem for so many years. And he did that which was right in God's eyes, or he did that which was evil in God's eyes. He followed all the bad ways of his father. But you can see that there's only one kind of king of the north. There's bad and worse kings of the north. Some of them are particularly horrible, like Achav, who brings, and his witch queen wife Jezebel will turn the entire northern kingdom to idolatry and bring a huge drought. Again, the drought, lack of rain. Just as political invasions from foreign enemies is viewed as an external sign of a deeper rot within the Jewish people and our relationship with each other or with God. In this case, so too things like drought are also a sign of God's displeasure with the Jewish people. So all these kings are bad. And remember, we talked about a contractual relationship that God lays out with us at Mount Sinai that's been going on now for hundreds and hundreds of years. You keep your side, I'll keep mine. It's like a bank account that you don't put money in but keep withdrawing. And eventually the bank says you have an overdraft limit, you're overdrawn too much. That's what's going to happen to the northern kingdom. When you see all the kings are bad. In the southern kingdom, you'll see a lot of the kings are obedient. Some are disobedient, and one especially is so incredibly bad that he will do such damage, it will be irreparable to the Jewish people. But concurrent with this, if we pull back, guys, and look at the geopolitical realities of what's going on, whereas King David and King Solomon had a strong unified kingdom, Israel traditionally in geography plays a huge role in human history, by the way, huge role. You don't realize how lucky you are to live in America. It's such an isolated country. When you live in a place where people are constantly, which has been civilized for thousands and thousands of years, and great empires are moving through, it's much less stable. America hasn't had a foreign invasion since 1812. Meanwhile, little Israel is sandwiched between the earliest great civilizations of the West, which is Egypt to the south, and Mesopotamia, which, by the way, is a Greek word, which means the land between the two rivers. And you can see the two rivers there, the Tigris and Euphrates. And it's many great empires and peoples will migrate through here, and we're constantly getting crushed, and major empires are fighting battles on our territory. It's a blessing and a curse being where we are in history. The blessing is if we're supposed to be impacting humanity and what we've been doing for thousands of years, and we're right there with the earliest civilizations ideally placed to impact the civilizations around us, to spread the ideas of one God and absolute morality to the world. If Abraham had moved to Walla Walla, Washington, it would have taken millennia longer for us to have an impact the Jewish people. But it's a curse in that, again, we're sandwiched between these empires. And unlike David and Solomon's time, when the Assyrian Empire, because Mesopotamia is not the name of a specific empire, it's just a piece of real estate, the land between two rivers. First, there's the Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire, which we're going to talk about both of those now, and the Persian Empire, which is our next class to the north, because a lot of empires will be moving in around, and that's a much less naturally defensible area than Egypt to the south, which will be the world's most continuous civilization. In over 3,000 years, it's conquered maybe 4 times. But both these empires will expand tremendously during the divided monarchy, which means that we no longer enjoy the peaceful borders. We're being sandwiched from the south and sandwiched from the north. And during this entire period of time leading up to the destruction of the first temple, guys, we will be, both the northern and southern kingdoms will be vassal states of usually the Assyrian or the Babylonian Empire, and sometimes a little bit of Egypt. But sandwiched between these two empires. Vassal states, if you remember a more modern example of the Cold War, when countries like Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia were part of the Soviet sphere of influence in the Warsaw Pact. If they tried to break away like Poland tried to do in 1981, then the Russian army would just invade. So we're paying tribute to these kings. So it's a very tumultuous, unsettled relationship. So not only is there strife between the northern and southern kingdoms, and there's spiritual rot, especially in the northern kingdom with idolatry, we also have constant problems from without. And again, if we pull back and appreciate what's going on, ultimately it's because we do not have our act together. If we were getting along with each other, there wouldn't be a divided kingdom. And if we were worshiping God correctly, we wouldn't have idolatry, and these kingdoms wouldn't be bothering us. But that's unfortunately what happens. The northern kingdom is just disaster after disaster. And the last 19 years of the northern kingdom are basically under the Assyrian Empire. And you can see in the background is actually, you see it's cuneiform. That's how they used to write, these wedge-shaped marks made in. That's actually writing there, and this is actually from an inscription from a frieze done in a palace. And so you can see people going into exile. I'll show you some really cool ones in just a couple of minutes. But because the Northern Kingdom is so bad, and because they just keep withdrawing from the bank account in their negative, idolatrous behavior, and there's no good kings, and there's no money deposited in the account, spiritual money deposited in the account, slowly but surely, because God often does it subtly and slowly, he will start to whittle away at the Northern Kingdom. In 575 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser, who is the emperor of Assyria, will exile Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, the tribes that are over the Jordan River, on the other side. Fast forward to 567, Shalmaneser V will take away Zvulun and Naphtali into exile. And the exile was was a way of pacifying rebellious people. And finally, in 556 BCE, this Assyrian emperor Sargon, excuse me, it should be Shalmaneser, I don't know why Sargon's in there. It's Shalmaneser V, destroys Samaria and exiles the remaining tribes. And that's what, and you can see in the book of Kings in chapter 17, second book of Kings, when the king of Assyria marched against the whole land, he came to Samaria, which was the capital at the time, and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of he's the king of the north. The king of Assyria captured Samaria. He deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Hala and on the river Chabor and on the river Gozan and in the towns of Media. This happened because the Israelites sinned against the Lord their God, who had freed them from the land of Egypt. Notice, God's being really explicit here. The geopolitical reality of why it happened is because we rebelled, but the real cause is God will find nations and empires that will use their free will to do his will. It's such a huge point to understand. Who had freed them from the land of Egypt, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the customs of the nations which the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, and the customs which the kings of Israel had practiced. The Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn back from your wicked ways and observe my commandments and my laws, according to all the teachings that I have commanded your fathers and that I've transmitted to you through my servants and prophets. The Lord was incensed at Israel, and he banished them from his presence. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. Boom, that's it. The whole northern kingdom will basically go into exile. And they're gone. They're gone. This is the famous 10 lost tribes that we hear about. And what happened to these people? Largely, they basically assimilated. There's a tradition that at the end of days, they will come back. There's millions of people around the world who claim to be descended from them. But unfortunately, the vast majority of Jews didn't make it. They're gone. They go into exile in the east and disappeared. And the northern kingdom is settled by a foreign people called the Samaritans that the Assyrians will put in place. But again, we have to focus on the message here that gradually God will whittle away at us, giving us little hits, little pokes to try and wake us up. And if we don't listen, eventually we become overdrawn too much to bank account, we get exiled. So this is this is the first, this is really the second major tragedy. The first is the division of Israel into two kingdoms after the death of King Solomon. But this is the first real major tragedy. After being in the land of Israel for centuries, a huge chunk of the Jewish people, the majority of the tribes will go into exile and disappear. The 10 lost tribes. So that's happening to the kings of the north. So they're gone, and you can see bad, and it ends 556. So, but on the other side, meanwhile, the southern kingdom will last considerably longer, precisely because their bank account is not as overdrawn. And we actually have a couple of extremely righteous kings. The greatest of all is King Hezekiah, who's the 12th king of 14th king after King David, and 12th king of the divided monarchy, 12th king of just Judah. Here you can see, isn't this cool? This is Hezekiah's seal. This was a clay seal on a document using his royal stamp. Isn't that really cool? This they found in north of the city of David, south of the Temple Mount, about 2 years ago, Alat Mazar. Lest you think this is, myths and fairy tales, the more we dig, and I volunteer dig in the city of David every week. It's been closed for the lockdown for 5 weeks. Tuesday again, I'll be back digging. It's unbelievable experience. You're pulling the history right out of the ground. But Alat Mazar from Hebrew University found, this is the seal. It says this is the script. Notice what's interesting. This is the Ankh, an Egyptian sign for life, and there's a bird here. But this is in First Temple period Hebrew. It says Hezekiah the king. So this is Hezekiah's seal that was used to seal documents, scrolls with clay, and then they put the seal like putting an envelope and sealing it up. So Hezekiah, he did what was pleasing to the Lord, just as his father David had done. He trusted only in the Lord God of Israel. There was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor though those before him. So he is really one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people. So great is Hezekiah, by the way, that Jewish tradition says God wanted to make him the Messiah, the level of knowledge amongst the Jewish people. This is when we're doing it right. He got rid of the idolatry. We're getting along. Everyone was educated. The Jewish people were unified. It was perfect. By the way, Hezekiah gets deathly ill at one point, and Isaiah, his prophet, we also found his seal next to this one. It seems to say Yeshayahu, and it's missing a few letters, but it seems to say Yeshayahu Hanavi, Isaiah the prophet. Isn't that amazing to find the seals of both of these people from 2,700 years ago? Isaiah tells Hezekiah, "You're going to die because you didn't marry and have kids." And Hezekiah says, "But I knew I would have evil children, and rather than have evil children, I decided not to have any children." And Hezekiah says, And Isaiah says, it's not for you to decide about the future. A king of Israel not marrying and having kids is a desecration of God's name. So Isaiah says, Hezekiah says, I'll tell you what. Isaiah, you give me your daughter to marry. She's really righteous. Hopefully we'll have good kids out of that. So Isaiah says, no, sorry, you're going to die. But as he's leaving, God appears to Isaiah and says, go back, tell Hezekiah to marry your daughter. You got 15 more years of life. And that's what he does. But in the meantime, we know that Hezekiah also has to deal with the Assyrian Empire in the north. And the Assyrians, he will rebel against the Assyrian Empire. He will make a treaty with Egypt and rebel against the Assyrian Empire. And to prepare for that siege, which he knows is going to come, he will do two things, which I'm sure you probably have all been to Israel. And if you've been to Jerusalem, if you've done tours, you've seen this stuff. He will do two incredible building projects, which we've now uncovered through the archaeology. One is he will build a wall, which includes now encircles what's the Jewish quarter of today, bringing it inside the walls of the city, right on Plugat HaKotel Street in the Jewish quarter. You can see right here, the wall right over here. There's a piece of it that they left uncovered. I'm sure some of you know what I'm talking about. And does an amazing engineering project, digging a 530-meter long tunnel that brings the spring where the water supply for the city was outside the walls into a pool inside the city wall. And you can see Isaiah here describing the building projects, both the fortification of the city and the construction of the pool. And it's so cool because you can, as we dig under the ground, we find exactly what's being talked about in the book of Chronicles, in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Kings, Hezekiah's incredible building projects. And we know that although the Assyrians and Sennacherib will surround the city, he will not take Jerusalem. And Isaiah prophesies, as he comes, so will he go back. And the reason is, guys, because Hezekiah is righteous enough that we still have the divine protection. Unlike the kingdom of the north, which went into overdraft and no longer was protected, and God sends enemies against to drive us out and send us to exile, the southern kingdom still had that protection. By the way, he doesn't take Jerusalem, but he takes a number of cities south of Jerusalem near Beit Shemesh. One is called Lachish. And it's really cool if you go to, this is now sitting in the British Museum, you can see the frieze from Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh, which is today in Iraq. And look at this, guys. These are images of the siege of Lachish, the fall of the city. And you know what's so cool about this? I love this because this is the first images of Jews in artwork. Once Lachish fell, this is ancient, this is it. This is before BC, before cell phones, so no one could take pictures. But here you could see, once the city has fallen, here you can see the Assyrian siege equipment besieging the city of Lachish. This is how our great-great-grandparents used to dress and look, according to the Assyrian artists, going back 2,700 years ago. So Jerusalem will survive. Unfortunately, getting back to our narrative, which is we're approaching the final act of the story. Unfortunately, Hezekiah, and what he saw would happen exactly happens. He marries Isaiah's very righteous daughter. He has a son. His son's name is Menashe. Menashe is absolutely the most evil of all kings, period, anywhere. As great as Hezekiah was positively, in a good sense, in his relationship with God and the Jewish people strengthening the relationship with Torah, Menashe was absolutely the opposite. He brings in all of this idolatry and you name it, and he persecutes the rabbis and starts going after the teaching of Torah. It's like a self-hating Jew par excellence. He says, because King Manasseh of Judah has done all these abhorrent things, he has outdone in wickedness all the Amorites did before his time. And because he led Judah to sin with his fetishes, fetishes is a word for gods, little gods these. Assuredly, thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, I am going to bring such a disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that both ears of everyone who hears about it will tingle. I will apply to Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria and the weights of the house of Ahab. Ahab was the evil king of the north. I mean, he says, I'm going to do to these guys what I did to the guys in the north. I will wipe Jerusalem clean as one wipes a dish and turns it upside down. It's such an incredible image, like just taking, boom, wipe it out, finished. By the way, Manasseh at the end of his life actually does tshuva, but it's too much damage. He overdraws the bank account too much. And going back to remember the arrangement that was laid out at the very beginning of our relationship with God. We keep our side of the bargain, he keeps his. But we didn't keep ours, and so much damage is done that we're going to go into a massive decline. Meanwhile, we have to pull back out again and understand the geopolitical realities of the ancient Near East have now changed. The great world power that is now on the scene is Babylon. Babylon will absorb the Assyrian Empire. One empire is always absorbing another, and especially in that part of the world, you can see there's one on top of the other. Babylon will greatly expand all the way down into Egypt, by the way. Will become a vassal state of the Babylonian Empire. And this is the beginning of the end. This is the end of the book of Kings, bringing us to the final act of our story here. The last 5 kings of Judah are these guys. One is Josiah ben Ammon, who's ruled for 31 years, was actually an incredibly righteous king. He comes on the footsteps of Manasseh, and Ammon, and he does a lot of work to reestablish Judaism and strengthen the Jewish people spiritually. He's putting more money back in the bank account, so to speak, more currency, trying to undo the overdraft that was caused by Manasseh. His fatal mistake, unfortunately, is the Babylonians are fighting the Egyptians at the time, and Pharaoh Necho of Egypt says, I want to march through your country to go fight the Babylonians. Let me pass through, I won't bother you. And Josiah says, I can't do that. I can't you march through my country. And he goes out to try and stop the Egyptians from marching through Judah. And unfortunately, he is killed in battle. But the next king who comes after him is Jehoahaz ben Josiah. He rules for all of 3 months after Josiah is killed. And then Pharaoh Necho, who's still controlling Judah, not for long, will take him out. He's replaced by Pharaoh Necho, by a guy by the name Jehoiachim ben Josiah, who will rule for 11 years. And he will rebel against the Babylonians, and the Babylonians will replace him. By this point, we are now a vassal state of Babylon. And this is all in the Book of Kings, and there's not a lot of detail there about this, of the geopolitical realities of this and what's going on a deeper level. But at this time, we only have minimal independence. And Jehoiachim ben Yoshiyahu will rule for 11 years. After him will come Jehoiachin ben Jehoiachim. They just do this to confuse us. So he is the son of Jehoiachim. He's going to rule for all of 3 months. And this is when Babylon makes a huge move on the kingdom of Judah. It will invade from the north because the Jewish people are being rebellious and not obeying. It will invade from the north. He will actually, at this point, the Babylonians will actually enter Jerusalem. They won't destroy the city. It's not a siege. They come. They will take the king captivity. He's only king for 3 months, and will take 10,000 of the best and brightest Jews with him to Babylon, which, by the way, at the time seemed like a terrible disaster. It's a great example of a huge idea we have to keep in our minds when understanding how God acts in history. The Talmud says, "HaKadosh Baruch Hu makdim refuah maka." God places the cure before the disease. Since no matter how badly we blow it, some Jews always have to survive. We never get to a dead-end situation where we have no way out. And God, like an amazing chess player, I'm sure some of you watched that incredible TV show, The Queen's Gambit. If you watch chess is all about being ahead in the moves, ahead of your opponent. God is always ahead of everyone. He's outside time and space. So he's often setting things in place. So 11 years before the destruction of the southern kingdom, he will take 10,000 Jews and place them in Babylon, because the Babylonian policy as a world power, the Assyrians just like to pacify people by moving them around. The Babylonians like to do brain drains on the people they conquered and bring them to their capital and make like a united colors of Benetton, multicultural empire whose center would be full of the most talented people from the world. So at the time, it seemed like a disaster that all the best and brightest of the Jews are being taken out. But when we fast forward to the destruction, which is coming up in just a minute, we'll see that when the Jews get to Babylon, they found that these people had been there in advance and put the infrastructure in place. Unlike Jews who come to America between 1882 and 1914, 2.5 million Jews leaving Tsarist Russian persecution, they get to the United States and there's no Jewish infrastructure, no school systems, kosher meat, very hard to find, nothing. So it turns out to be a big blessing in disguise. But anyway, the final king of Judah, as we approach the climax of the story of our interaction with the Babylonian Empire, is Zedekiah, not to be confused with Hezekiah, who was that very righteous king, but Zedekiah ben Josiah, who's going to rule for 11 years. And the prophet at this time is Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is warning the king, and Jeremiah had a very tough time. He's like the biggest party pooper. The king is listening to all these false prophets telling him the temple will protect you. Mikdash Hashem, Mikdash Hashem. And Jeremiah's message, and he's speaking to us today, guys. He's saying, don't be overly obsessed with your holiness. And what the criticism he's giving the Jewish people is about not taking care of the widows, the orphans, the downtrodden, the oppressed. He says, you got to take care of these people. If you don't, there's going to be consequences. It's such a big lesson for us, guys. We have to be balanced Jews. Any stringencies we're going to take on our relationship with God in terms of kashrut or Shabbat observance or anything like that have to be balanced against how it's going to impact our fellow human beings and our fellow Jews especially. But he's not listening. He's listening to the false prophets telling him, as long as the temple in Jerusalem stands, you're protected. So he's getting ideas in his head that he's invincible and he could stand up to Babylon. And Jeremiah, by the way, to warn him, will write a scroll. Actually, the scroll is first written before Zedekiah's time. It's actually written during the reign of Jehoiakim, 2 kings before. He writes a scroll prophetically warning what will happen. And if you read in Jeremiah chapter 36, it actually talks about that it was the writing of the scroll. It says it was that Baruch ben Nuriah, he says, it was then Baruch ben Nuriah in the chamber of Gamaliel ben Shaphan, the scribe, in the upper court near the new gateway of the house of the Lord, read the words of Jeremiah from the scroll to all the people in the house of the Lord. And it says, Michaiah, son of Gamaliel ben Shaphan, hurl all the words of the Lord read from the scroll. That scroll is the book of Lamentations, book of Eicha, which was written prophetically as a warning, because bad prophecy, guys, is always a warning. It doesn't have to happen. Good prophecy will happen. Bad prophecy is contingent. Get your act together. It doesn't have to happen. Like your mother says, eat your Brussels sprouts, you get the chocolate cake. But if you don't listen, you don't get dessert. By the way, Jehoiakim will burn that scroll. Now, what's really cool is the Jeremiah scribe is Gamaliel ben Shaphan, and here you can see, found in the city of David, going back almost 40 years ago, here is the seal of Gamaliel ben Shaphan over here. He is the scribe who may well have written the book of Lament. Actually, Jeremiah dictates it, but he may have been the actual guy who wrote the scroll of Lamentations. So here you can see, and you can see how big it is in real life. It's really cool, this stuff. But fast forward to the final king, Zedekiah, and we find one more seal, by the way. I just want to show you this because it's so cool, because the history just comes alive when you find it in the archaeology of the city of David. When you get to the reign of King Zedekiah, he's already had it with Jeremiah not shutting up and screaming about do tshuva, come back, stop rebelling, submit to Babylon. God is sending Babylon to oppress you. The king of Babylon is only doing the will of God, and you better listen, otherwise you'll pay the consequences. So they found another seal about 20 years ago up above where they found this seal. And I should show you that in a minute. I think I'm going to have that. There it is. Yeah. But before we get to that, it's second book of Kings. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did what was displeasing to the Lord, just as Jehoiakim had done. Indeed, Jerusalem and Judah were a cause of anger for the Lord, so that he cast them out of his presence. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. So again, the geopolitical causes of the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be the insane, crazy rebellion of the kings of Judah against the world power of Babylon. But we see that the Torah is always letting us know really clearly that because we didn't keep our side of the bargain and misbehaved, the consequences are going to be that God will send an enemy against us. Here you can see, by the way, this seal was found by Elat Mazar, the same one who found Hezekiah's seal and the same one who found Isaiah's seal, in what she thinks is King David's palace. And this is Yehuchal ben Shlemiah. How's that for a name? How's that for a seal? And where does that appear? chapter 37 of Jeremiah, one chapter after the Gemaryahu ben Shaphan seal. And Yehucha ben Shlemiah is not a nice guy. He wants to have Jeremiah killed, as a matter of fact. But here you can see the book of Jeremiah. King Zedekiah sent Yehucha ben Shlemiah and Sphania, son of the priest Menashe, to the prophet Jeremiah to say, please pray on our behalf to the Lord our God. What happens to Jeremiah, because he won't shut up, because the prophet's job is to always get us to wake up and do tshuva, is he's thrown in prison. And he rots in prison. But what happens is, of course, that the king, listening to the false prophets, will prepare the city for war and break his fealty, his treaty of loyalty to the king of Babylon. The emperor of Babylon will send a huge army against him to besiege the city. And it says at the end of the book of Kings, and in the 9th year of his reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, moved against Jerusalem with his whole army. He besieged it, and they built towers against it all around. The city continued in a state of siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So it's like for 2.5 years, it's an incredible siege. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine had become acute in the city. There was no food left for the common people. The image in the back is like a wood carving of Jeremiah, right, reading the book of Lamentations, and women holding their starving children, as described in the book of Jeremiah. Even cannibalism is described because the famine was so extreme. In a house that was found, by the way, destroyed when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, in the city of David, a house that was lived in for many hundreds of years called Achiel's house. King David's palace is believed to be up above over here. They found here, guys, just one last piece of archaeology to show you as we come to the end. This is a toilet. This is a fancy house. You can see here's the house, there's the kitchen, and here's the bathroom. This is the oldest toilet you've ever seen. It's a 2,800-year-old toilet. When they lifted the seat off, Josias, the paleopathologist, going back, it had never been cleaned out or flushed the final time since the destruction of Jerusalem under the Babylonians. Believe it or not, even the stuff you leave in your toilet is fascinating to a paleopathologist, which is one of the more interesting aspects of archaeology, because you could tell about disease and diet from what people leave in their toilets. They found in the fecal matter left in this toilet, analyzed only a few decades ago, a huge amount of grass. When would you eat grass? When you're starving to death, exactly as described in the book of Lamentations. And a parasite only found in meat eaten raw. We don't want to think of what kind of meat that was, because it was probably cannibalism, and it was eaten raw because they had long since run out of wood. But exactly the horrible accounts we read in the book of Lamentations, Eicha, are exactly what happens as a consequence of the Jewish people rebelling. The bank account is overdrawn to the point where it's gone past the point of no return. Meanwhile, Jeremiah, who is rotting in a pit as a prisoner of the king, it has to listen above as the city walls are breached. And you can see what happens in the book of Kings. It says, they captured the king, the city walls are breached. They captured the king and brought him before the king of Babylon in Riblah. The king tries to escape through a secret 18-mile underground tunnel that supposedly connects Jerusalem with the Dead Sea. He's caught there. They slaughtered Zedekiah's sons before his eyes. His whole entourage is caught as they come out of this tunnel. And he has to watch all of his 10 sons being killed. Oh my God. Then they blind him. They bring him in, was chained in bronze fetters. He was brought to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, that was the 19th year of the king, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, an officer of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burnt the house of the Lord, the king's palace and the house of Jerusalem. And he burnt down the house of every noble person. The entire Chaldean force was with the chief of the guard, tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. And the Jerusalem is destroyed. The city's destroyed. The temple's destroyed. And think about it. We had a first temple for 410 years. And prior to that, we had 430 years of living in the land of Israel before the first temple, under the Joshua, under Judges, under the book of Samuel. So 840 years. Again, guys, we live in diaspora today, and we're used to living. I live in the old city, thank God, but we've been used to living for thousands of years amongst as minority and amongst the non-Jewish world. But imagine the trauma of not just living through the siege and the destruction and all the things that went along with it, but having Jerusalem destroyed and going into exile. The fact that we survived that is an incredible story, which we're going to touch on certainly in the next class. But it's truly the first great tragic event that will take place on the 9th of Av, the same day as the spies badmouth the land of Israel, and God says, you're crying on this day for no good reason. We now find out that we're crying for a very good reason. And we can see here, as we see the timeline that we saw before, 422 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroys the first temple. The Jews have survived the siege and the destruction. A small number will stay in Israel and later flee to Egypt, but the majority will go down to Babylon, which is where that song comes from. One of the Psalms that Don McLean and Bob Marley sang by, the rivers of Babylon. It's a song of mourning sung by the Jewish people as we're being brought down into captivity in Babylon. We're not kept prisoner there. We're released in Babylon. We will settle in Babylon, making it the first diaspora community, the oldest community of Jews living outside. Today it's Iraq. We all know where Iraq is. Ambrose Bierce, the great writer from the Civil War, he said, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. So we all know where Iraq is today. But the Jewish community of Babylon will be around for 2,500 years. That'll turn into the Jewish community of Iraq, which is more or less gone today, but will survive until 1948, 1967 as a diaspora community. And they will get there and find, thankfully, that the Jews, that 10,000 Jews had gotten there 11 years early and put some infrastructure in. So as traumatic as it is, at least we won't find ourselves without Jewish infrastructure. But we will have to adapt to a unique situation we'll find ourselves in, which is living as a Jewish people outside the land of Israel, which is never something the Jewish people were meant to do, because so much of Judaism is meant to be kept in the land of Israel. But just to close with some of the lessons we learned, because the whole point of doing this is to focus on what we could take out of these stories, besides just covering the history. Number one is that, like I said before, we have a contractual agreement with God. We keep our side of the bargain, he keeps his, and this still holds until today. If we want to avoid tragedies and future Holocausts and God for anything else like that, we have to have our act together as Jewish people, being balanced Jews, a good relationship with God and a good relationship with each other. That is so important. And we also learn how so much in this period of time, especially that so many of the tragedies that led to the downfall of our kingdom in the land of Israel have to do with bad leadership. Good leadership is such a critical factor in Jewish history. Like I said before, it's the most challenging leadership position on the planet Earth. I'm sure you all heard that apocryphal story about when Harry Truman says to David Ben-Gurion, first prime minister of Israel, you have no idea what it's like to be the president of a country of 1.8 million presidents. And Ben-Gurion says, you're right, but you have no idea what it's like to be the prime minister of 1.8 million prime ministers. Because it's easier to be the emperor of 1 billion Chinese and the mayor of a town of 100 Jews. It's such a critical, so few and far between have been good leaders in Jewish history. But another thing we have to keep in mind is we're not all about dictatorial leaders bossing us around. Judaism demands a high level of personal responsibility. We see that from the book of Judges. And if we have bad leaders, it's our responsibility to fix them. And it's a very big concept in Judaism that we get the leadership we deserve. And if we are acting with a level of responsibility and accountability on a personal level, we will get the leaders that we deserve. And that's the great symbiotic relationship that we have to be able to get to where we're supposed to be going in history. And most important of all, which is the great lesson of this tragic event, is that all geopolitical situations have a deeper root cause. And we can't get distracted by the symptoms. Whether it's the destruction under Babylon, the first incredible tragedy in Jewish history that led to exile, or the Holocaust, 67 Six-Day War, 73 War, what's going on with Israel today, Iran going nuclear, or trying to go nuclear, we have to always remember that it has to do with something that we're doing. And while we need to focus on defending ourselves and defending Israel and standing up for Israel and voting for politicians who defend Israel, you're not supposed to rely on miracles. Bottom line is, those are only symptoms. We must always be aware of what our mission is in this world and what the cause of our shortfalls are. And it's always within our responsibility, individually and collectively, guys, to get our act together. And even at the last minute, turn things around and have things end in a positive way. And unfortunately, we have a lot more negative things going to happen in Jewish history until we get to the end of our story. But again, I apologize so much for that incredible delay and racing through all this. And we went over time, I know, but there was a lot to cover there. I have a great website, kenspiro.com. You're welcome to go there. All my content is online for free. And you're welcome to send me feedback or comments or ask questions on the website. I'm happy to take some questions now if anyone likes also. I'm going to stop
Ken,
sharing
if you
my
could,
screen.
Ken, if you could, there you go. If anybody has any questions, please feel free. First of all, I just want to thank again Ken for a wonderful presentation. Really very informative, and we really appreciate it. To work that out with technical difficulties. Just a reminder before everybody leaves that next week will be the second part, and then there'll be 2 more sessions in March. It's the same Zoom link, and if you enjoyed it, which I'm sure you all did because you're still on, please feel free to tell your friends because I think each presentation is a standalone presentation. Any questions?
Really good.